Matthew chapter 23, we're not going to really stay there, but it was just on my heart this morning. I do have a chicken thing going here, but we've got 4 baby chicks at our house, and I was just listening to them chirp. And this verse came to mind, and I just thought it was interesting. It's also what we're going to be talking about today. But you guys know this passage. When we first got chickens, I asked the Father, I said, "Are chickens in the Bible?" And then I remembered this verse. It's Matthew 23, right before Yeshua. That's the infamous chapter 24, but it says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, killing the prophets and stoning those who are sent to her. How often I wish to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her children, or her chicks, under her wings. But you would not." Aw, you're so good, Chris. You know, that still is heart. Even though some of the stuff that we're going to be looking at last week and this week about Jerusalem, Mark made this point in our house today. We were talking about this. He said when Yeshua came, he didn't go to China. He didn't come to Nashville, Tennessee. He didn't go to Peru, or what's a city in Peru, John? Where did he go? He came to Jerusalem. Why? Because that is where his name has been set forever. Amen. And that is where the millennial kingdom will reign. But as Mark was leading us today, the kingdom of Jehovah is not fully manifested yet. The kingdom of heaven has been sent in us, and we take it as ambassadors, yes. But I got to tell you, Mark says this all the time, if this is the kingdom of heaven, then it stinks.
That's right.
I'm just saying, it's not here in its fullness yet.
No, it's not.
And we have a part to play in that, but only He can bring the kingdom. And we're going to be talking about that today. He can bring the kingdom, and Jerusalem has a part to play, and Jerusalem is in the news this week. Israel has its 70th year anniversary on Monday.
Wow.
May 14th, 1948 to May 14th, 2018. 70 years. Significant time. May is a significant month this year. So let's look into this a little bit more today. But it says, last week we looked at an important foundational principle from John chapter 18, where Yeshua clearly established that His kingdom is not of this present world. Now that's kind of hard to think about when you look at the nation state of Israel today. To say that Yeshua's kingdom is not of a kingdom of this world. There's some people that might argue that point with you. I'm not arguing the point. I'm just looking at the two thoughts side by side. Yeshua said, "My kingdom is not of this present world." And then He said in verse 36 of John 18, "And His reign is not from here." This world cannot produce the reign of Yeshua.
Hallelujah.
I love Israel. I am Israel. I am the seed of Jacob. I'm a daughter of Abraham. But this world cannot produce the kingdom of heaven. It is going to be radically introduced. The kingdoms and the kings and the everyday routine is going to be violently interrupted. The heavens are going to be ripped. Every mountain is going to be brought down. Every mountain, if you believe the prophets. Every island is going to be removed from its place. The kingdom of heaven has to come with violence. And it will be violently introduced, and every king and kingdom and queen and prime minister and sovereign of this earth will bow their knee when the Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach, appears, the anointed of Jehovah, riding on the clouds, shining like the sun. This is not it yet. It is in measure, but in the fullness, no way. Not yet in its fullness. Yeshua, again, his kingdom is not of this present world. Stop trying to make it a part of these nations, of this world.
That's right.
His reign is not from here. This current cosmos in the Greek, world system, cannot produce the kingdom of heaven. Yeshua gave a defining characteristic of what would happen when his reign comes upon the earth, and it's found in this verse. My servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. What's one of the characteristics of how do you know when the kingdom of heaven, the reign of Elohim, is violently interrupting? It's very simple. His servants fight for him. You will see his servants fighting for him. In other words, when the Messianic kingdom physically begins on this earth, it won't be subject to the Edomites, who, if you remember when we studied Esau and Jacob, how in the intertestamental period, from what most Bibles are, Malachi to Matthew, you have the Rhodian kingdom that is set up there where the Edomites had been put into Judea. They mixed with Judah when they were brought back into the land, and they infiltrated into the high priest. They married into the priestly lines. They married into the scribe lines, and they became infested with Edomites. Herod was an Edomite. Judas Iscariot was of Edom. So you have this Edomite kingdom that are really enemies of the Jews. And then you also have Rome working together, who is also part of the Edomite line, really. And so you have this infusion, but Yeshua was not there yet to fight them. He recognized them. You brood of vipers, you say you're sons of Abraham. You call yourself Jews, but your father is not Abraham, because if he was, you would not be acting like you're acting. But because you're wanting to kill me, that's what serpent seed does. Therefore, you're identifying yourself as Edom. He confronted them. He named them.
Come on.
But he didn't go to Rome and take Caesar's head off. He didn't pick it in front of the Senate and say, take down Rome. Take down Rome.
Come on.
He didn't kill Caiaphas, an illegal high priest in his temple. He knew that this was not the time. And we're going to talk about why. But when it is the time, what you're going to see is the heavens erupt in warfare. Revelation chapter 12 talks about it. Michael is going to stand up. Daniel chapter 11, chapter 12, verse 1. And thrones are going to be set in place. And then things are going to begin to happen. When the Messianic kingdom comes, it will no longer be subject to the Edomites, those who call themselves Jews but are not. When the Messianic kingdom comes, it will not be subject to Rome or any other nation state. But let me be clear, the Messianic kingdom declared by the prophets has not come in its fullness yet. But when we see the war in the heavens that results with the Messiah of Yehovah Elohim, son of David, sitting on the throne with his enemies, his footstool under his feet, Psalm 110, and teaching Torah from his set-apart mountain, as Isaiah and other prophets prophesied, specifically chapter 2 of Isaiah, then we will know that the Messianic kingdom has come in its fullness. It is important to have this understanding to properly view the coming end and the events that we are about to navigate at the end of this age. The Messianic kingdom of Israel is not here in its fullness. We need to understand that. As wonderful as the political, geo-religious system of Israel is today, they reject Yeshua as Messiah. If you are Messianic and believe he is the Messiah, you cannot have citizenship in Israel. Is that his kingdom?
Come on.
They fully fund abortion, state funded. Is that his kingdom?
No. It's capital homosexual.
And homosexuality is known as one of the capitals is Tel Aviv. Is that his kingdom?
That's not his kingdom.
I love Israel. I love Jerusalem. It is the eternal city. God has put his name there, but it has been infiltrated and will continue to be infiltrated, even more so, until the violent eruption of the Messianic reign in this earth.
I like that.
Now that's hard to hear for some, and you may not agree with it today, but I'm telling you, you need to keep it in your understanding and in your pocket. Because if things don't go the way that the Left Behind book said it would,
Come on.
you better have a plan B.
That's scriptural.
Number 2, we also need to remember that the Jews were looking for the Messiah to set up his kingdom when? At his first appearing. They wanted a kingdom. And they missed the hour of their visitation. Why? Because they had not been taught the prophecies or had scriptural understanding concerning the suffering servant of Isaiah that must come first. Say first. Everybody say the suffering servant
The suffering servant.
must come first.
Come first.
It is a scriptural prototype. Number 1, suffer. Woohoo! Number 2, reign. Number 1, suffer. Number 2, reign. That is a scriptural prototype.
Yeah.
We have to emulate our Messiah. If we want to reign with him, guess what we get to do first?
Suffer with him.
Prove our faithfulness. Prove our endurance. Prove our confession of faith. We get to prove it. And in proving it, it's turned into gold for eternity. The testing of our faith is more precious than stock market.
Uh-oh. Come on.
They didn't understand that suffering came first. So when Yeshua said, I have to go and I have to be turned over and I have to die, they heard it, but they couldn't get it. And much of us in the assembly of God is like that today. I want to reign now. I want to have my big ministry now. I want to have my big name now. I want to do it now. I want to have my retirement now. I want to have my reward now. I want to have my mansion now. Well, you can have it now, but you may not have it later. Because the scriptural prototype is suffer one and then get birthed into the kingdom and reign.
Hallelujah.
Ever since Adam, it is the primary temptation of man to get for himself what God is not giving him at the time. It is the primary temptation of Jews to want their kingdom now and not wait for Messiah to give it to them.
Good.
That is what the temptation of the second Adam, Yeshua, in Matthew 4 is all about. I will wait until my Father gives it to me. Come up on this high mountain. I can give you the kingdoms of this world now. You don't have to go to the cross. You don't have to walk in obedience. You don't have to suffer. You don't have to put up with those ragtag 12 guys you're hanging out with. You can have it now if you'll just kiss my ring. Yeshua wouldn't do it. He passed that temptation. He is in us by His holy Ruach HaKodesh Spirit so that we can endure to the end and not kiss the ring and inherit His eternal glory. But it's the common temptation. Kingdom now. Now. I want it now. It's got to be now. Read the scripture. John the Immerser declared this as his ministry was diminishing. I've said this verse so many times to myself. John chapter 3, verse 27. His little congregation was all going over to somebody else's congregation. And it's really tempting if you get your esteem out of what you do instead of whose you are, to judge yourself that way. And his congregation ran up to him and said, John, what are you going to do? All your congregation's leaving, going over here to Yeshua. You know what he said? John chapter 3, verse 27, no man is able to receive any matter unless it is given to him from heaven. Two words are contrasted in that verse. No man is able to receive. Say receive. Honey, you can get it all day long. If you want to go out of here and work your butt off, you can get rich. If you want to go out here and, do whatever you want to do, you can get, especially in America. Go get it, go make it, go have it. But there's a difference between getting it and receiving it.
Come on.
Because if you get it, you need to understand this, then you birthed it. You're the father of it. You're the progenitor of it. And if that's progenitor of it, and if you are, you have to sustain it. You have to keep it. And that's why so many ministers get caught in pulpits with pleasing men's spirits. Because the ministry turned into a work of their flesh that they made happen because they were taught that you have to do this to have ministry, to make this happen. And so they started, but then when they started, they have to compliment men and bow down to men and please people in their congregations in order to sustain it. Because if they really preach the truth, they're probably going to leave, and they know that if they leave, they're going to take what they have with them that they're using to resource their flesh ministry that they began and birthed out of their own initiative, gifts and talents that God gave them, but they're prostituting them to the spirit of Babylon. How do y'all know that? Because I did it. I came out of it. I repented for it. And I'm hanging out with Yeshua in the wilderness, leaning on my beloved. And He is beautiful to me. Scripture declares that once before the installed reign of Yeshua HaMashiach on earth, man will be tempted to make his own messianic millennial kingdom, but without the true Messiah. And the result will not be peace forevermore, but the scripture says the result will be the end, with God coming down and walking in His garden again while men scurry for the bushes. Once more, followers of Yeshua will be tested with the emulation of the suffering servant. As the world hated me, so the nations will hate you. But I feel sometimes like I'm one of those disciples, that I hear those words from my Messiah. I have to go to the cross and die. Okay, but I just really don't get it yet. Not until that night when the kiss of Judas, the Edomite betrayal, occurs, do you really get it. We need to remember, as we were singing last week in worship, we had that spontaneous flow about the Omer count, which is the Feast of Weeks. What is an Omer? It's a type of measurement. We're in a Sabbath, 49 days, 7 weeks of Omering. God is measuring. What's He measuring? Omer count starts with the harvest, starts with the barley harvest, and then it goes 7 weeks to what? The wheat harvest, Shavuot. What's happening in those times? God is measuring. An Omer is a count of measure. It's a dry measure. He's being measured. Measure. How many times in Scripture was there a prophet that went with an angel and said, measure this, measure that? What does that mean? That means it's being judged. That means it's being weighed. We're in a season during this time to be reminded that we're not counting down like the world. You go to New York City, Times Square on January or December 31st, and what do? They count down 10, 9, 8. NASA is about to launch a big rocket into space. What do? 10, 9, 8. No, but when it comes to God's kingdom, you're not counting down. What are you doing? You're counting up. Because we're not ending. We're just birthing something new. And every sabbatical season was written down in Genesis chapter 2, verse 1, recorded right there. The end from the beginning. We're counting up to what? We're counting up to the Messianic age. That's what we're counting up to. We're counting up to the violent interruption
Come on.
of the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, parting the heavens, rolling it back like a scroll with a shout and an iron scepter, saying, enough! Bringing Torah to earth. Before this Messianic age, where the Son of David, Yeshua HaMashiach, will sit on the throne and rule the nations with an iron scepter, there is a birthing that takes place. And what happens during birthing? You want to quit. There's so much pressure. You wish you hadn't gotten into this. I think I'll change my mind. Have you been feeling that pressure even still in this peaceful season? That pressure just to want to quit, just to be discouraged. What's the use? Just to give up. Don't quit. Look at your neighbor today and say, push. Come on, say push. This is not the season to get discouraged. This is not the season to quit. Beloved, the Messianic kingdom of heaven that saints since Adam to now have longed to see is about to erupt upon the scene. And it is the season to push past your discouragement. It's the season to push back your problems and your situations that are trying to hold you down, that are trying to put you in a constraint. It's time to push. And when we see one another fighting with discouragement or weariness or depression or complacency, we need to just walk up to one another and say, push. That we may inherit what is coming. There is a birthing that's taking place right now. The earth is even shifted 2.5 degrees. Volcanic activity is going off the charts. Rifts are showing up in continents as Africa, they say, is going to be ripped in two. Earthquakes in places that haven't had them. 100-year records are being broke. I don't know how many places have flooded. Talk about the days of Noah. But the earth is in birth pains right now, and the kingdom of heaven is coming, and his people are about to enter into that in its fullness. This earth is in birth pains. Even now, the heavens have announced the birth declaration. And the kingdom of Jehovah is about to manifest in its fullness. So like John the Immerser in the spirit of Elijah, I declare today, children of Israel, repent and return to Jehovah and cling to the eternal covenant during times of distress. Call upon the name of Jehovah that you may be delivered. May our fathers in the faith who have gone before us turn to us, and may we, their seed, turn to them and labor together as one new man in Yeshua for the esteem of Jehovah and his kingdom. Let the disobedient be turned back to righteousness and make ready a people prepared for Jehovah. Oh. With these thoughts in mind today, we are going to continue to look at some of the prophecies and historical events concerning Israel and Jerusalem. Most of us have heard of the scripture about Jerusalem becoming a heavy stone. Right now it's all over everywhere because so much is going on with Jerusalem. Becoming a heavy stone. But there are some interesting prophecies concerning this text and this event that in my experience are rarely talked about. And I just want to just briefly bring them to our attention today because I would like to look at them. So let's turn to Zechariah, the book of Zechariah. For most, it's toward the closing out of the Old Covenant. Now, Zechariah, the book itself, is known as the apocalypse of the Old Testament. Did you know that? Zechariah's main emphasis is this violent eruption of Yeshua in his second coming. The second coming emphasis is all through this book. It talks about the coming messianic kingdom age. Do you know what Zechariah means? Does anybody know what Zechariah in Hebrew is? Zachariah. Zachariah. Does anybody know what Zachariah means? Do you remember what Zara means? Zara means remember. So Zechariah means Jehovah remembers. Friends, if we knew the time that we lived in, that would be a comfort to us. He hasn't forgotten.
Right.
He remembers. Now, Zechariah is a book that was written post-exile of the northern and southern kingdoms. They had both fallen at this time. They'd both already gone into exile, and the southern kingdom was returning, the remnant. In fact, Zechariah had been born in Babylon. He was a very young man at the time of this book's writing, and he served Jehovah in the years after the remnant returned from the 7-year Babylonian exile. He partnered with Haggai, the book right before this, and with Ezra in the rebuilding. His prophetic career is marked in chapter 1, verse 1 by the reign of not an Israel king, not a king of Judah, but of Darius, a Persian king. Interesting, Iranian king. Why? Because there was no Judean or Israeli king. In fact, there's not been a restoration of the kingdom. There's only been restorations of the temple. They've always been in subjection. Even during the Herodian time, they were under Rome. Because the kingdom cannot come without the Messiah. Now, if you read Guzik about Zechariah, he has an interesting insight. He says, if all we had was the book of Haggai to go by, we might conclude that all God was really interested about during this time was in the temple, in the rebuilding of it. But Zechariah gives the rest of the story, and he shows how God is not just interested in buildings, but he's interested in lives. Zechariah prophesies about the future time when Jerusalem will again come under siege. Now remember, Jerusalem actually came under 3 sieges before it fell. It had already fallen, already gone into captivity, and was already being restored back. And Zechariah is prophesying about a coming siege. This is not Titus in 70 AD, and I'll show you why most commentators discount that in just a moment. So this is a prophecy that has yet to be fulfilled, and that many feel, and I feel, that we are entering into. Zechariah chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Bless you. The message of the word of Jehovah against Israel. Jehovah stretching out the heavens and laying the foundation of the earth and forming the spirit of man within declares. Now, does he have authority to declare over Israel? I think he's laying it out right there in chapter 1, his credentials. Number 1, he's the creator. All right. Number 2, he's in all authority. And so he has the credentials to make this decree. Verse 2, see, who's doing this? Jehovah, okay? I am making Jerusalem a cup of reeling to all the people. Say all. All around, say all. And also against Yehuda or Judah, it is in the siege against Jerusalem. Verse 3, and in that day it shall be that who's doing this? Who's in authority? Who has the credentials to call this? Jehovah does. And in that day it shall be that I make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all. Say all. There's an all lot of alls here. Okay? For all peoples. All lifting it are severely injured. And all the nations of the earth shall be gathered against it. Say all one more time. All peoples, all nations, all those people that go to deal with this situation are going to be injured. All peoples, all nations that come and deal with Jerusalem during this prophesied time God has decreed will be injured. My question in the nation that I live in is if this is being fulfilled currently, if Jerusalem is becoming a cup of trembling for the nations right now, then is America included in the all, or are we an exception? Because of the emphasis of people versus physical temple that Zechariah carries, I believe that this also makes us think of Yeshua's words in Matthew 24:9, where he said, "You shall be hated by how many nations?" All nations. Why? Because of my namesake. As we, being the true temple, after the resurrection of Yeshua, and we being of the new Jerusalem of Jehovah, this could also have dual purpose here. That anybody going to touch his people, and his people are going to become a reeling for the nations. Now, I'm not emphatic about that. I actually think both may apply. But I think there may be a natural and spiritual purpose here to these verses. Now, on May 14th, Chris, if you can put PowerPoint, I think number 3 up there, which is, as I said, Monday of this year, 2 days from the time of this teaching, we have the 70th anniversary of the nation state of Israel. The celebration of the current nation state of Israel as brought about by the Zionist movement. Now, if you see, here's just a webpage screenshot I captured. Israel's 70th anniversary. The banquet's actually on the 19th at the Hilton in Dallas. And you see 2 speakers there. You have Mike Evans on the left, and you have Mike Huckabee on the right. And oops, I don't know why, there's a picture there at the bottom of Mike Evans talking to Sharon Perez and Pope Francis in the Vatican there. I know Sherez sold Israel out to Pope Francis and was calling for a one world religion and Pope Francis to head it up before he died. But I'm sure there's really nothing to that picture, so I'll just let that go for now. I don't know how that got on there, but I would like to define Zionist for you just a little bit, because I was talking to somebody this week and they really didn't know what Zionism was. So I thought, well, we just need to back up and define that. So Zionism is a movement, this is according to the Oxford Dictionary, a movement for the reestablishment and the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what is now Israel. It was established as a political organization in 1897 under Theodore Herzl. I'm sure you've all heard of him. And was later led by Cam Weizmann. So that's how this political movement of Zionism came about, which if we dare, we may go a little deeper in today, we'll see. But on Monday, we have President Trump and many other leaders now desiring to move what? Our embassies to West Jerusalem. Say West Jerusalem. Interesting that the Palestinian leaders are coming together and saying we want to move our embassies to East Jerusalem. I only have one question about that. Could this be a subtle division of the land? Could this be a subtle 2-state solution? But I'm sure Pope Francis has nothing to do with it. But I'm just wondering, as you have this going on, I wasn't sure about the West, so I looked it up, and if Isabel Kushner of the New York Times did an article on March 2018, and she said that the compound that they're initiating for the U.S. Embassy is, quote, the fortress-like compound sits partly in predominantly Jewish West Jerusalem and partly in a section of no man's land between West Jerusalem and predominantly Arab East Jerusalem. Also pulled up an article about Erdogan over in Turkey. Interesting little guy there. But Turkey's Erdogan calls Jerusalem U.S. Embassy move a huge mistake. Imagine that. But this was put out on Wednesday, May 9th, 2018, fairly recent. And he said this, speaking exclusively to CNN, all right, this is where this comes from, in Ankara on Tuesday, Erdogan said that there was, quote, nothing to gain, end quote, by the move and urged the U.S. to reverse the decision while there was still time to do so, repeating his claim that, quote, East Jerusalem is the capital city of Palestine, close quote. And one day, and will one day be home to an embassy serving Turkey's interest in a Palestinian state. He also said that the decision had contributed to isolating the U.S. diplomatically, pointing to the United Nations vote in December when 128 countries condemned the decision and just 9 supported it. Erdogan said, the United States is losing true friends right now. Then he went on to say, by reimposing sanctions on Iran, Trump is declaring an economic war, which sanctions don't hurt the head regime, they hurt the people. That the world can ill afford, the Turkish leader said. Now, what they don't tell you in the press today, which I find interesting, at least I haven't found it in the press. I heard a prophetic man talking about it, or I wouldn't have known about it. But on March 17, 2018, do you guys know what happened? On March 17 of this year, China successfully launched the Petro 1. Now, China is the largest importer of oil in the world. They partnered with Iran, not Iran, but Russia, who is currently the largest exporter of oil in the world and is also allied with Iran and Syria, as you know. Now, that's just interesting that the biggest importer and exporter of Iran have made a successful launch and push against the petrodollar. Now, if you know anything about how the financial system of America works as far as its conception and foundation, then you should know the reason why every single person in this room today is indebted in slavery through our government for like $38,000 or $1 million apiece or something, whatever it is when you break down the government deficit to individual households. If they knocked at your door today and said, John Nye, you pay me $38 million or you're going to go to jail because you're a debtor. I'm a debtor because we live in this system. Could we do it? But we can keep, as America's system, printing what they call fiat currency that we all know has no-go backing, that has been removed. And so when we need money, we print money. We do the inflation rates. We do whatever through the founding of the Federal Reserve, which there's nothing federal about the Federal Reserve. It's privately owned. But the reason why American can keep spending money and printing money and living this high style without any consequence is because of the top way of countries around the world to buy and sell oil has always been in the petrodollar. And what we don't see slowly creeping in is this challenge to the petrodollar by the launch of China, which is a soft economic warfare against America. Very interesting, the week after that happened, we're going to shoot cruise missiles in Syria. What would push us to go to war? Maybe the challenge of our whole economic system. You see, it's interesting that in August of 2017, what happened? There was a total solar eclipse that went across our nation. Everybody went out and oohed and awed. Since that time, it's interesting. what has been happening to America abroad? Could we be seeing the beginning of the decay of the United States of America's supremacy of a superpower? What happened right after the eclipse happened in August of last year? Russia went full swing into Syria and eclipsed our superpower status in Syria, and we stood down. Do you remember that? Now we have our petrodollar being challenged, and I don't really know what we could do about it. And there's other things in the works today. But my question is simply, could we be seeing the beginning of the bringing down of the America that we have been born into by the nations of the world? I think it's an interesting thing to consider. Another thing that you need to know about the stuff that's going on in the background is, this is an older article, but it was from thetrumpet.com, and it was put off, I believe, in 2009, I think is when this was put out. And the title of it is called "The Vatican's Hidden Jerusalem Agenda. Why did the Pope visit Israel and why now?" Now, this Pope at this time was John Paul II. But there's some history here that I think we need to know. If you watch Israeli News Now, I think it is, or Israeli News Live with Ben-Nun on the internet, then you know that there's already a secret deal with Jerusalem and the Vatican, and what's being played out is simply being played out. Back in the mid-1990s, a statement made by Pope John Paul II during an interview in his native Poland broadcast in Italian over a Polish radio station was noted by one of our Italian associates. Now, this is a Christian ministry, prophetic ministry here. She sent us a transcript of the interview, which included one particularly starting reference by the Pope regarding the Vatican's ultimate goal of transferring its headquarters from Rome to Jerusalem. You see, the Antichrist beast system will have a military capital, a financial capital, and a religious capital. What was unusual about this admission of John Paul II was the Vatican's intentions to possess Jerusalem are seldom publicized and little commented on. In fact, an air of secrecy, something that the Vatican has a history of creating over various of its affairs over the centuries, has surrounded this project since the failure of the Crusades, the most obvious of the overt and now very historical attempts by the Vatican to seize control of the Holy City. Those attempts have a long history with strong attachments to the German nation, right up to the past 2 world wars and beyond to our present day. As far back as the 8th century, say 8th century, 8th century AD, emissaries were sent to Jerusalem by Emperor Charlemagne to negotiate an agreement with Muslim Caliph Harun al-Rashid. The result was Jerusalem became a protectorate of the Holy Roman Empire. I want to say that again. The result was Jerusalem became a protectorate of the Holy Roman Empire. What's a protectorate? A protectorate is defined as a state that is controlled and protected by another. So, what church has control of all the holy sites in Israel and Jerusalem today? Historical records indicate that such a protectorate was limited to the oversight of the welfare of Christians and the care and protection of designed holy sites and the properties of the Roman Catholic Church in Jerusalem. The fact that the Caliph would be a financial beneficiary to this enterprise was a given. Muslim support of the Kaiser's army in World War I and again the Nazi regime in World War II was the end result of a long historical nexus between Muslims and Germany. And if you haven't seen the pictures online of the popes meeting with Hitler and everybody thinking it was wonderful, you need to do some research. Vatican and German diplomatic moves in Israel are both linked, both of them, German and the Vatican, to a common end, possession of the old city of Jerusalem and most of the eastern half of the city. The Jews are the pawns in this grand game of international diplomacy. I want to read that again. The Jews are the pawns in the grand game of international diplomacy, and the Palestinians are the grunts on the ground, eager to help divide Jerusalem and annihilate the state of Israel in the process. The Vatican already has a significant presence in Jerusalem. Under Israeli law, Rome has legal jurisdiction. I'm going to say that again. Under Israeli law, Rome has legal jurisdiction over and free access to its holy sites, including both its institutions and assets, which are a lot, in Jerusalem. Did you know about the secret agreement that made this happen? Have you ever heard of the fundamental agreement between the Holy See and the State of Israel? Raise your hand. I hadn't either. The consolidation of these arrangements came in a bilateral agreement termed, quote, the fundamental agreement between the Holy See and the State of Israel, end quote, which the Israeli government signed with the Vatican on December 30th, 1993. The terms of this agreement, composed in secret, were subsequently legislated by the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. What remains largely unknown is the secret deal made by current Israeli President Shimon Peres, whom you just saw shaking the hands there of Mike Evans, and the leftist peacenik and former Meretz party member Yoshi Berlin, who was widely known as Perez's poodle. Now, on June 15th, 1994, you're hanging with me? 1993 was the secret deal. Here we are on June 15th, 1994, 6 months after signing the bilateral agreement with the Vatican, the Israeli government inked another agreement with the Vatican endorsing the Roman Catholic Church's participation in negotiations to determine the future of Jerusalem. This was followed in 1996. So we have 93, 94, 96. In February of 1996, by Secretary General of the Vatican, Sergei Sebastian, announcing that Rome recognizes Palestinian sovereignty over East Jerusalem, the Vatican had thus revealed its hand. 4 years later, so this would be year 2000, 4 years later, the Palestinian terrorist Yashar Arafat met in audience with Pope John Paul II at the Vatican. Two signed an accord normalizing relations between the Palestinians and the Roman Catholic Church and agreeing to work towards establishing Jerusalem as an international city based on international guarantees. Later that year, the Pope visited Israel, declaring that it was the main obstacle to peace in the region. Skipping forward, it is clear that Germany's and the Vatican's Middle East policies are aligned. Each is patiently playing both ends, Israel and the Palestinians, toward the middle. And I find this very interesting right now. When there was a headline just last week when we backed out of our Iranian agreement that Europe is right now staying in with Husseini, or whatever the guy's name is in Iran, and there was a headline that came out by the Chancellor of Germany. What's her name? Merkel came out with a headline that says, it appears that Europe can no longer trust the U.S. for their security, referencing NATO. Now, if you know the long game here, and you believe that the two legs of the statue of Rome turn into the 10 toes of the miry clay in Rome, so an extension or rebirthing of the Roman Empire that's going to somehow birth the Antichrist persona of the Antichrist, which most people still believe and look at, then you have this this world stage shaking here. All of a sudden, where the world peacekeeper of America is being pushed aside currently. We'll see how it plays out. And you have Europe rising up and saying, you know what, we're going to start defending ourselves. In fact, they're changing their budget. I did a little bit of research on it, and they're starting to put millions of dollars into their military buildup in Germany. The last time that happened in the world, it didn't play out too well. And you have Emmanuel, God with us, guy in France. What's his last name? Something like it's another M, Merkel, and that guy in France, Emmanuel. I just found that interesting. He is going around saying we need a European army. We need to build up our forces. So maybe Erdogan is not so far off by saying there's an isolationism that seems to be coming to America. And I don't know. I mean, we're going to worry about the size of New Jersey because they're a threat to us called North Korea. And now all of a sudden they're kissing each other. They're loving each other. They don't look like such a big threat anymore. And we were going to go bomb them? Last year? I mean, wow, that's a big change. You got the financial change. You got the military change. You got relational change, the image of America in the world. I'm just saying, since August 2017, when the U.S. was eclipsed, there's interesting things happening on the world scene in relation to those things. I believe it's very possible we could start to see the rise of the beast army and the declining of the peacekeeping militarization machine of America that has been established around the world. What the end game of that is, I don't totally know. But I know that it's happening. The UN General Assembly also agrees by its Resolution 181. And it's always been this way, ever since Zionism rebirthed what they call Israel. The UN General Assembly Resolution 181 states that Jerusalem is an international city. And its current formation, Jerusalem was declared to be an international city. Now, this is interesting when you look at PowerPoint number 5, the next one. I'm not going to show you the clip again, but last week, I introduced as well that there's a huge majority of Orthodox Jews in America and elsewhere that do not believe the current political nation state of Israel, often referred to as Zionist, is of God and publicly holds rallies to stand against it. And there's just a few pictures you can easily find on the internet. Go back and view them, or just go on YouTube and search it for yourself. Now, most of us have heard, going back to Zechariah here, this Israel becoming, this Jerusalem rather, becoming this cup of trembling for all peoples and for all nations. That is yet to happen. But then what happens is most prophecy teachers immediately segue into verse 4. In that day, declares Jehovah, I strike every horse with bewilderment and the rider, and it goes on to the deliverance of Israel that happens, in Jerusalem that happens at that time. My concern is that this will follow, but will it immediately follow this time because of some other scriptures in this passage that I'm going to ask you to be open-minded enough to look at? It will follow, but the timing in prophecy is important and allows always the Father's hand in holding the timing of these things to be fulfilled. And what you find when you read the prophets is that they are in and out of time frames. And they have a time, they go forward in a time, they come back in a time. And it takes the Ruach HaKodesh within us to identify the heart of God in applying these scriptures that have been prophesied to the events in today that we have. And so you have the God coming in on this city that becomes this cup of reeling. You have the hope of the restoration and the deliverance of God proclaimed on through the verse on through chapter 12, on into chapter 13 about a fountain of the house of David. And then he starts to talk about false prophets that are going to rise up with unclean spirits from the earth. And they're going to put on hairy robes to deceive. And you have all this stuff, but then people are going to look at them and say, why didn't you prophesy this trouble and everything that's coming? And they're going to say, I'm not a prophet. I'm just a man sold as a slave in my youth and blah, blah, blah. And then you have verse 6 of Zechariah chapter 13. And it says, and one shall say to him, what are these wounds in your hands? And he shall say, because I was struck at home by those who love me. Now, this is concluding the section concerning the false prophets that are going to arise if you take this in succession during this time. It is not uncommon for a false prophet to mutilate their body. So it very easily could be talking about why were you beat up. But it's strange to me if it's true that he says his body was mutilated because he was struck by those who love him at home. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And then especially when this verse was quoted by Messiah himself in Matthew chapter 26 that we see here later in this passage. Or could it be that the false prophets will not even recognize Yeshua, the Messianic King, when he comes as the humble servant, as they didn't when he came the first time? This then could be viewed as a prophecy of what would happen as those of Yeshua's own house who would say they loved him, but they would strike him, they would kiss him on the cheek, and they would hang him on a stake. If the latter be held, it is interesting the contrast between Yeshua being struck in verse 6 here of this chapter at home by those who loved him, and the calling for the sword in the next verse to awaken and to strike the one mentioned. Let's read 7 and 8. O sword, awake against my shepherd, against the man who is my companion, declares Jehovah of hosts. Strike the shepherd and let the sheep be scattered, but I shall turn my hand upon the little ones. And it shall be throughout all the soil, declares Jehovah, that 2/3 therein are cut off and die, and 1/3 is left within. This shepherd is seen as Jehovah's companion or his friend. Now it is interesting, as Zechariah also prophesied what would occur with the Edomite Jew, known as who? Is Judas Iscariot. If you go back to chapter 11, verse 12 through 13, just pop back there for a minute. Chapter 11, verse 12 and 13, like 500 years before this happened, Zechariah declares, and I said to them, if it is good in your eyes, give me my wages, and if not, refrain. So they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver. And Jehovah said to me, throw it to the potter, the splendid price at which I was valued by them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of Jehovah for the potter. If you know the story of Judas Iscariot, they took the 30 pieces of silver and they bought potter's field where he hung himself with, prophesied. So you have this betrayal of those within his house who say they love him, even prophesied within this chapter. The betrayer who is seen as Yeshua's friend. This shepherd who arises, who calls himself a companion, a friend of him, actually is the betrayer. This passage is also quoted by Messiah, as we said in Matthew 26, at the time of his betrayal. We know the disciples were scattered, but the verses following this passage have not occurred. And again, with the Hebraic mindset, it's filled until it is fulfilled. Now, in prophecy, a shepherd is synonymous with a leader. So could this be referring to the worthless shepherd that most see as the Antichrist, that you find following that passage in chapter 11, verse 17, that says, "Woe to the worthless shepherd, forsaking the flock." How are we going to know who he is? He is a description of physical appearance. "Let a sword be upon his arm and upon his right eye. His arm shall wither, and his right eye shall be dimmed." Most see this as a reference to the Antichrist. Could this be the worthless shepherd who says in disguise and in scheming trickery, "I am a companion," and betrays Israel? Now what's interesting also, when you see verses 7 and 8 in this sequence, and then again, you have the deliverance thrown in there in verse 9. "And I shall bring the third into fire, and refine them as silver is refined, and try them as gold is tried. And they shall call on my name, and I shall answer them. I shall say, this people is my people, while they say, Jehovah is my Elohim." So if in this sequence, this is being prophesied by Zechariah, it appears that a shepherd or leader of Israel will be betrayed and struck, and will result in 2/3 of the people in Jerusalem to be cut off and die, and 1/3 remain a remnant. There but will be refined by fire. Jehovah will fight against those nations who come against Israel, but not until after destruction. And I want to say that again. In the prophets, you find that Jehovah will come and will fight against him who has brought destruction against Israel, but not until there is a measure of destruction. Now, Guzik, a commentator in Blue Letter Bible, about this passage said this. When he says, "I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem," he said Zechariah seems to have the very end times in view, when Jerusalem will be surrounded and attacked by some type of international force. When the Romans came against Jerusalem in 70 AD, they came with a multinational army and brought terrible destruction on the city and its people. Yet, there was none of the deliverance that Zechariah will describe in the following verses after verse 3 through the remainder of that chapter 12, and also we see in chapter 13. So it is difficult to say that this was fulfilled in the Roman attack at 70 AD because there was no deliverance. Therefore, these scriptures await a future fulfillment of Jerusalem becoming a trembling cup for the nations, of Israel being surrounded by all nations, of being attacked, 2/3 of them being led astray, the remnant being remained but being purified by fire. And then you have chapter 14, which you also, at least I don't hear many people talking about. Chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. It says, "See, a day shall come for Jehovah, and your spoil shall be delivered in your midst. And I shall gather all nations to battle against Jerusalem, and the city shall be taken." Wait a minute. We always hear about the Battle of Armageddon, right? They're coming against Israel, they're going to attack, and boom, Yeshua comes and Israel's delivered. I think we need to have an understanding that there's a middle ground here we need comprehension of, or our faith will be shaken. "And I shall gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women ravished." He says here, half of the city shall go into exile, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. And then he switches again and he goes into the deliverance. What deliverance does he go into? The Mount of Olives. When Yeshua comes down, look at verse 4. "And in that day his feet shall stand upon the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will split in two." And hopefully you know that. But we need to have a mindset that there is going to be some destruction seen to Jerusalem before this happens.
Okay.
And I'll just close with these statements today, although these are big statements to close with. But there have been big statements today. As I stated earlier, if you research Zionism, and I encourage you to do that, you will run into a man named Theodore Herzl. But if you dig deeper, you will run into the next slide in our PowerPoint, a name that most of us are familiar. It means red shield. What's the name? Rothschild. Edom, red, Jew, interesting. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, a powerful Jewish banker in Germany in the 1800s, who built the largest banking dynasty in all the world still to this day. This banking dynasty, these are big statements. You'll have to search it out on your own, or I can throw some videos your way. This banking dynasty pushed for World War I and funded it. Funded the rise of the Third Reich, and at the same time, the men and families who joined with them set up the Federal Reserve in America and hijacked the wealth of this nation. These wicked men capitalized, listen to this, these wicked men capitalized on the dream of the Jews to return to their homeland. And although opposed by many rabbis, and still to this day are opposed by many rabbis, they used Judaism to achieve their political goals. Hear this. Political Zionism is not Judaism. And I'm not all for Judaism either, because they make up scriptures and say God said it. But it's not the same thing. And you need to have some of these questions answered to spiritually frame what is about to happen in your world.
Good.
Number one, is Jerusalem where Jehovah has set his name forever? I would say yes and amen. Is Israel Jehovah's promise to Abraham and his descendants? I would say yes and amen. Are there people in Israel today who love Jehovah? I would say yes and amen. Is the current narrative of Zionism that has been sold to so many of us today who have come out of evangelical America of Jehovah? That is a question you need to answer. If you are going to properly navigate what is about to happen in the world you live in.
Good.
Or you may find yourself a pawn in a beast system and your faith shipwrecked. Is it anti-Semitic to not support Zionism but to love Israel and the Israelites? That's a question you need to answer. The Jews in New York don't think so. I'll end with a quote from Rabbi Yisrael David Weiss from azquotes.com. He says this, and I quote this rabbi: Zionism is only around 100 years old. It is the transformation from religion to nationalism, to materialism created by non-religious Jews who hated their religion. The reason why they use the name Israel, the Star of David, hijacking, stealing the identity of Judaism and the Jewish people, is in order to gain a legitimacy for their existence that should lead people to say, oh, it is God given to them, and that they should use fear and intimidate people from speaking out against their actions, because they will call those who do anti-Semitic. It couldn't be anything further from the truth. End quote. How many have heard of Albert Pike's letter about the world wars? Could you raise your hand? There is a seed of Abraham in America. Our political structure has been hijacked. There is a seed of Abraham in Israel. Their political structure has been hijacked. And on it goes. The wheat is still growing among the tares, but the upcoming time of pressure of Jacob's trouble, who gave Jacob trouble? Will separate the two. Currently, we are still under a hijacked governmental system known as Babylon. Some people call it deep state, shadow government, the Illuminati, yada yada. Scripturally, though, it's known as Babylon. Babylon is governed by fallen principalities under the satanic kingdom, and their end goal, as given to the Masonic Satanist Albert Pike, if you'll go on to the next slide, who has a virtuous statue in Washington, D.C. Why a Satanist has a statue in the Washington Monument in our nation's capital is a question that needs to be answered. He was a Masonic Satanist, Albert Pike, in the 1800s, as you see his prominently placed statue here. He talked about, through listening to these principalities and powers, wrote about the 3 world wars that would come. Again, he wrote this letter in the 1800s before they happened. 2 of these wars have already happened and have gone down just as he wrote, the 3rd of which is currently in play. And I know I said I'll leave you with that, but I will leave you with this because it's just important. Slide number 9 gives you the quote. The 3rd World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agentur of the Illuminati between 2 things: the political Zionist and the leaders of the Islamic world. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam and political Zionism mutually destroy each other. Friend, if you can't see that being played out and built up in the world that we live in, and he goes on to say in his letter, the mutual result will be Christians losing their faith because they don't understand why Israel/Zionism was destroyed. We could go on to the Project for the New America, but we'll have to stop. Father, we pray for wisdom. You said if we lack wisdom and we ask, you would give it to us. And Daniel, you wrote that in the last time there will be people with understanding, and the end result of that will be in amidst the most devastating time in human history, they will shine with His glory. Father, this is not depressing. This is not without purpose. But it is as you have had us focus on in worship today, your kingdom is coming. But Father, let us properly understand that before the rain comes the suffering servant. And help us, especially those of us in the American religious system who have been taught we don't have to suffer. Father, help us. Prepare us and our brothers and our sisters in Messiah that when the pressure gets hard in the birthing, to remember what's about to violently break upon the scene and to look at one another and say, push. It will be worth it. Let us faint not, and let us grow not weary. And Father, I don't know if this week will just be another step toward the return of Yeshua as embassies and kings and leaders make their moves. And yes, fallen principalities and powers and spiritual wickedness have a conspiratorial agenda that they have been pushing through their men and women through the centuries. But Father, we think overriding it all are the prophetic words of Yehovah that have been uttered and even revealed their plan to his people before it happens, so that when it does, as Yeshua told his disciples, when you see this, know that I told you beforehand. That our faith not be shaken, and that we can not only encourage ourselves, but encourage those and encourage those around us who may not understand what is going on in their world. The birthing of the true messianic reign of God in this earth. We say, come, Yeshua.